outside, and to really get a chance to hear from the people who are involved in these issues. And we're really lucky tonight because we have two of the artists/researchers who have made some of the pieces here in the Glassroom, and they're here to tell you about them. And they've come, both of them, a very long way to be here, so we're really excited about that. We're joined by Manuel Beltran, who's an artist and an activist and a researcher. And he researches and lectures on contemporary art, activism, and contemporary social movements, post-digital culture. And he's been part of the Tactical Tech and Glassroom family for a long time now. He also joined us at our exhibition in London. So we're happy to have him here today. In 2015, he founded the Institute of Human Obsolescence, which posits a future where humans are no longer needed for their mechanical work and only for their data work. And you can see an extension of that project here in the Glassroom. It's the piece called Data Production Labor, where you scroll through your Instagram feed and then see how much you would be paid for your data labor, as it were. And he's joined by Nayantara Ranganathan, who is a researcher and lawyer. Through the Internet Democracy Project, she has explored questions of what it might mean to have a feminist politics of data. Her work addresses freedom of expression, surveillance, net neutrality, and the gendered use of the Internet. She co-conceptualized Gendering Surveillance, a project on exposing the gendered nature of surveillance in the Indian context. So together, Manuel and Nayantara created AdWatch, which is a tool that you can see downstairs. It visualizes political ads on Facebook and Instagram around the world, and it helps you see how ads are targeted towards particular demographics. And tonight, they're going to talk about how that project came about, how they created it, and the stories that can be kind of mined from that data. So let's welcome Manuel and Nayantara.
Thank you, Christy. Can everyone hear me well? Can you try?
And me, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Well, it's very exciting to be here. We started 6 months ago working in this project, and most of the time remotely, so it's also new for me to have Nayantara next to me. And it came a long way from when we started in India to being working remotely for days and nights to be now in San Francisco, a bit in the belly of the beast of the subject matter that this project touches. We are going to tell you a bit about our understanding of what is targeted advertisement, particularly political targeted advertisement. We are going to tell you and guide you through the process of making AdWatch. It was not an easy path to collect all of these advertisements and create the project. And we will leave you, hopefully, with some questions in what is the impact of political targeted advertisements for democracy and, in general, for how we perceive reality at large.
So maybe the real question to start with is what are political ads and why should we care about them? So unlike in the age of print or broadcast, where ads were still something that people created, advertising on the internet is delivered through an understanding of our personal data in a way that is targeted but also optimized and delivered in quite a predatory fashion. So we might have been able to, we're still able to look at a billboard and either have a conversation about it or a discussion and a disagreement about it because we're all looking at the same thing. But when it comes to political advertising delivered over social media or on the internet more broadly, it's delivered specifically using information about us that kind of optimizes for something that I'm most likely to react to or I'm most likely to engage with. So this breaks down, this arguably breaks down a shared understanding and also a shared experience of political reality, of messages by politicians, and therefore possibly for political action even.
Right. So we started in India. It was around 6 months ago. It was just before the elections in India. It was the largest democratic exercise that had happened so far in history. It's an election that happens in 7 different phases. Different regions have different voting days. And we were trying to understand how politics were being performed in new media. So we have a certain understanding, and we have legal framework when it comes to what is allowed to do or to say on TV, on radio, on newspapers during a political campaign. But we wanted to understand how those frameworks, regulations, or basically how people were using the online space for performing politics.
And the most important instrument that came out of that elections that pertained to social media was that a number of companies, including Facebook, but also Indian companies, came together along with an industry lobby group to submit something called a voluntary code of ethics to the Election Commission, where basically they made some commitments which had no consequences. So they made statements like, in the interest of freedom of expression, we will try to make sure there is integrity and transparency in the elections, and offered to do things like expedite complaints processes, etc. But none of these were backed up with any consequence for not being able to deliver on it, but it was more a good faith document in which they said that we will try our best to do it. And this caught our attention. We were quite curious to understand how political ads were playing out on all the different platforms.
Right, so we look at a number of different platforms. We started with Facebook, Google, Twitter, but we also look at more India-specific platforms such as TikTok, ShareChat, and other platforms that maybe are not so known here. But at some point, we decided to focus on Facebook, and we started small. In India, there is something called the silence period. It's a period of 48 hours before the voting day in which no political campaigning is allowed, no political advertisements can go on TV, the politicians cannot be in the street making political campaigning. And we found 2,235 advertisements on Facebook that were in violation of electoral law. So in that moment, we faced one of our first crucial questions on, are we going to report these advertisements to Facebook? This is probably the most efficient, quicker way to report them. Or are we going to report them to the Electoral Commission in India, so to the public organism that is in charge of keeping the checks and balances on who is violating the law or not? And we decided to report it to the Electoral Commission. This is the email that we sent with the zip file with all the data on the advertisements, with the evidence, because to report those violations to Facebook will have meant that we are outsourcing the checks and balances of our democratic processes to a private company that, in the case of India, is also a foreign company. So, as a matter of principle, we did not want to outsource this process to Facebook, and we decided to report them to the Electoral Commission, which sadly did not give us a reply. We can speculate in our guessing on whether they did not understand the data, they didn't know how to navigate with it, they just don't understand what Facebook advertisement means. It's a question maybe if Facebook provided them of the tools to access this data, because it was extremely difficult to access the data, as we will point later. But this was the starting point of AdWatch.
And as this month-long process began to conclude, the Indian elections, what was coming up was also the Spanish elections and manuals from Spain. So we also started doing a preliminary look at what was emerging from the data of political ads in Spain, and we discovered something very curious, that a lot of ads that were created by politicians in Spain were actually reaching countries as far as the Philippines or Chile, etc. And because the Russian influence and foreign influence was such a trigger issue for the uptake of political ads conversation in the US, we found it quite interesting to look more into why it's happening, like why are these ads reaching countries outside of Spain, but also Spain was being targeted by.
Think about the idea that here in the US we had a lot of discussion in the Senate and in the media at large on the so-called Russian influence, on this foreign influence, but there has been very little to no discussion on how other countries have been subject to this foreign influence. Like, the discussion has been very much narrowed down to the United States. So at this moment, we were collecting the data on Spain. There were the European elections coming around the corner. We started to find systemic problem. So we are not speaking about one isolated case in India or in Spain, but we started to see that systematically, structurally, at a massive scale, there were a lot of problematics with these advertisements. And this was the turning point in which we felt the need of, we need to open up this data for other people to look at it. In the beginning, we were thinking, OK, we can just try to collect data in as many countries as possible and just to dump it online. We were collecting the data in JSON files. It's a format in which you can store databases. But it was important for us that this data was not only accessible for journalists that understand about data or data scientists or people with a higher degree of expertise, but that this will be something that all of us in a democracy should have the right to access, right? Like, it's important for me as a citizen to participate in a democracy, to be able to understand this data, not just that experienced journalists can access it. So it took us a few months more, and we created AdWatch. That it's a website. You can also experience it downstairs in the area of Open the Box. In a nutshell, AdWatch is a compilation of all the political advertisements of major political actors. And with political actors, we look into major political parties and political candidates of 35 countries. So we have a collection of over 300 different political actors that allow you to browse it in a country-specific base, but also allow you to browse it in a worldwide interface in which you can compare all the political advertisements around the world. So here in the screen, you see the interface of the United States, which allows you to browse it through 4 different interfaces: the map, the timeline, the content, and the details. You are looking now at a heat map. The redder the color, the more targeted that this region was. So in the US, California, Texas, New York, and Florida have been the states that have been targeted the most. It's interactive, so that means if you make a selection here and you just choose California and go to the timeline, you keep that selection. So this allows you to go deeper and deeper. For example, you can choose, I want to see which advertisements people in California is receiving. Click. And then you go to the next one, and you want to see which advertisements in California were seen by minors or by elderly people, of women, men. You can choose by gender. So it allows you to go deeper. This is how we like to say it. This is the content slide. So all of these squares represent all the political advertisements that have reached the United States. You also have a search ads bar that allows you to input a text that you want to search. So, for example, if you will search for impeach, you will find all the advertisements that currently are talking about the impeachment. And you can also search in the dates bar to, for example, decide, I want to see only the time before or after an election. On the top left, you see the biggest advertisement on the US. It's an advertisement paid by Trump about the construction of the wall. We have also a set of stories. So if in the website you go to the story section, this aims to be as a tutorial of the kind of questions you can ask. And a few of them are what US presidential candidates are speaking about tech. Another one is how much money has Trump spent speaking about the wall. So I think we are discussing a lot how much the wall will cost, but we can also see how much money Trump has invested in speaking about the wall. It's over 5 million, just so you know. And this is the detail section that allows you to understand the demographics, the spend, impressions, and regions. So in the top left, you can see ranges of age, 13 to 17, 18 to 24, and divisions of gender. And you can see how much each party has addressed one demographic or the other. On the right, you can see the spend. In this case, it's in India, so it's in Indian rupees. It adapts to the country, so it's either in dollars or in pounds or in euros, depending on the country. On the bottom left, you see the impressions that you might expect. If I invest more money in this advertisement, more people see it. But this sometimes is not exactly like that. So an advertisement that gets invested the same amount of money might have more or less impressions. And in the bottom right, we can see the regions that have reached this advertisement, that, as my colleague pointed before, we started to find a lot of situations in which political actors of one country were targeting many other countries outside. Did I miss something in the intro of AdWatch?
Maybe the final one?
The automated ads. So this is one image that also became the logo of the project. You can also browse through a worldwide interface that compares all the countries in one interface. And to give you a bit of understanding of what you see here, each of these circles represent 1 second in time. So for example, if you look at this big pink circle, that represents how many advertisements the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, is a political party in Germany, have created in just 1 second. So the bigger the circle, the bigger the amount of advertisements that were created in that very second. Therefore, through visualizing the data in this way, we can suggest that this is part of an automated effort. But this also allows us to understand the strategies that different political actors enabled by Facebook. So we have to understand that all of these are things that Facebook enables them to do. And all the blue concentric circle is the Trump constellation, that this allows us to see that they are using a much more granular approach. Instead of doing one big advertisement that is seen by a lot of people, they do many different versions targeted to many different demographics, or perhaps saying one thing to this group, another thing to other group. And this interface, you can also see it in the worldwide interface. Thanks.
Great. Maybe it's also useful to circle back and understand what do we mean when we say political advertising, which also takes us to the question of what do we mean when we say advertising on Facebook. So advertising is basically paying money to increase the reach or engagement of any post or a page. So anyone with a Facebook account can potentially pay money to increase what is called beyond the organic reach, so what it would organically reach on the basis of the algorithmic newsfeed, a bit beyond that to reach other people. And there's multiple ways of doing that, one of which is through creating an audience. And you can create an audience on the basis of 3 big buckets that Facebook classifies as demographics, interests, and behaviors. So demographics, for example, I'm able to target someone that recently got let off from their job, or someone that moved away from their house, or someone that happens to live on Mission Street. So there's different ways that you can do demographic targeting, and it's also like Facebook gives you a number of suggestions also to do that. Then there's interests, which Facebook allows you to target on the basis of someone who is a friend of someone that is celebrating Ramadan, which is an actual kind of category. Or someone that is interested in buying a MacBook, or someone that has returned from traveling in the last week and is looking to go abroad. So these are all existing categories that currently you can target on the basis of. And behavior also, you can imagine it's things like someone that is an engaged shopper, etc. And the important thing to know is audience by excluding people. And this became quite a controversial thing because in the US, for example, it was discovered by ProPublica that people were being excluded from housing ads on the basis of their ethnic, on the basis of race, on the basis of their ethnic affinities. That's what they call it. So that is targeting through creating an audience, but what you can also do is create something called a lookalike audience. So if I'm someone that has the email IDs or the phone numbers of all of my customers, I can give that dump of information to Facebook and say, find people that are like these people. Now, Facebook might do that on the basis of the fact that you live in the same neighborhood, or you like the same baseball team, or you're all allergic to peanut butter or whatever else, but basically an indeterminate number of characteristics that Facebook uses to create a different kind of audience that is as likely to engage with your product. So these are ads, and this is targeting, but what also happens is something called optimization, which is not about the content of the ad, but something like the time at which it's delivered to me, or the location at which it's delivered to me. So if I'm a person that qualifies for 3 different ads, if I'm someone that qualifies as someone from India, someone that uses ink pens, and someone that might be likely to buy a Coke, I will be presented the ad that I'm most likely to engage with, although I fall in all of these different categories. So it's quite predatory that it also has these kinds of determinations. Now with political ads, Facebook takes all of these massive number of ads that are created on its platform and tags some ads as relating to social issues, elections, or politics. So it's a tagging function that Facebook applies on top of all of these ads. Some of which are, I guess, not so subjective, like ads by politicians or official party pages are classified as political ads. But political ads is also shorthand for like social issues, because, for example, ads by Planned Parenthood in the US is something that does fall within quite the like hot button issues in politics, or guns, for example. But you can also see that it quickly becomes subjective selection of what these kinds of categories are. And in the US, for example, education and crime happen to be part of the list of things that fall within social issues, but in Austria, it's not the case. And beyond that, I think it's also this question of what isn't political after all. If you're having an algorithmic newsfeed in which I might be sharing something about a protest in Kashmir or a protest somewhere that news media might not be covering, I might be doing something that is very clearly a political act, or I might be doing something that is political to me, but maybe not the most hot button national political issue. So it also quickly becomes quite unclear what is classified as political ads and what's not. Mark Zuckerberg, in his speech a couple of days ago in Georgetown University, pointed out that the revenue that they get from political ads is extremely minuscule. So basically that. But maybe the important point to point out there is not the revenue itself of ads that they determine are political, but actually how then Facebook is incentivized to not bring a wider number of ads within the realm of regulation, simply because if you classify it as a political ad, automatically it comes within this demand for more transparency. I think that's a kind of a short intro to what political ads are and how the shorthand of political ads itself is super controversial.
Right. So now I'm going to brief you a bit on what is sold as political ad transparency, particularly how it was the process for us to collect all of this data. So a little bit over half a year ago, Facebook released the Facebook Ad Library. It's a tool that they claim provides transparency for political advertisement. It does not allow for any kind of systematic search as we can do with AdWatch. It's full of rate limits, so if you are trying to use their API, an API is an application programming interface that allows you to send automated queries through code, so you can, for example, monitor the new advertisements that are being released every day. So it does not provide any kind of meaningful level of transparency. Nevertheless, for us, in order to collect these advertisements, we had to follow through a verification process. To start with, in order to get access to political advertisements, you have to verify your Facebook account. This verification process is just available for 35 countries in the world, majority of them in the global north. So for the rest of the world, there is just no way to access them. In my case, I hold a Spanish passport. The process involves verifying that my Facebook name is my real name, verifying my phone number, and submitting a copy of my passport to Facebook that they verify matches. This verification process is not for accessing, for collecting political advertisements. It's the verification process that you have to follow to create political advertisements. So they did not create a separate verification process to collect ads, but they just reused the one to create advertisements. That, in our case, we were not really interested in making political ads, but rather to collect them. It's a super creepy situation. There are many details that we don't have time to speak, But one of perhaps the most shocking ones, it was that the process varies amongst countries. So while for me, from Spain, I just need to submit the passport, for Nayantara, being a citizen of India, she needs to submit extra documents. But Facebook also needs to send a person to your house to verify that you are there. So this in-house verification is done by a third company that has a different privacy policy than Facebook. So in my case, Facebook claimed that my passport will be deleted within 48 hours and they will not store this information. In the case of Nayantara, with this third-party company that Facebook outsourced this verification process, they still hold the data. So we managed to collect the information that we got. Sorry. Yeah, OK. We managed to collect the information that they collected. So basically, they go to her house, need a signature from a person living there, proving that she is actually living there, take a picture of the house and a picture of a landmark near the house, together with the GPS location. And this is one of the procedures in one of the countries. But in the case of Brazil, for example, it's a different procedure that is extremely complicated. And we must remind that, in a way, we are still belonging to the privileged set of 35 countries that can access to this. For the majority of the world, this process just does not exist. This was just to get verified so you can access the API. Once we got to the API, there is little to no documentation about how does it work. So they don't explain how it's being used. Facebook invests millions in user interface. They really have the resources to make things accessible and easy to use. This, in my opinion, is a deliberately effort to not make it accessible to people. With things, for example, there is a rate limit. So I can just perform 200 queries in 1 hour. So if we are speaking about collecting hundreds of thousands of advertisements, and I can just collect 200 every hour, there is no point in which I can use this tool in a meaningful access. It's full of errors. So one day you can collect advertisements, the day after you can't. There are rate limits, not just about time, but about computer resources. And we don't know what kind of other limits. Sometimes it just doesn't work, and we don't know why. But in generally, Facebook has managed to put the hat on their heads of, we are great, we are opening these transparency tools for you to see. While these are not transparency tools, those have been released after a lot of pressure and after the threat of regulation. If you look at the countries in which the access has been provided, it's countries that are threatening Facebook with regulations. So we should be careful when we kind of feel the good intentions of Facebook opening up these levels of very limited and problematic transparency, that is rather something that they are being pushed for and is still completely inefficient.
So assuming all of those problems that Manuel just spoke about were not present and you could access the data, even then, the state of political ads transparency as it stands today, and Facebook is supposed to be one of the stewards of it, it's quite problematic. So on the left, there are fields of information that are available in the name of transparency. So that is things like the currency in which the ads were shown, the demographic distribution, that is, were women between the ages of 25 and 35 shown ads, etc. But these are not the same fields of information that were used in targeting. So for example, if I use the fact of, I want someone that went to a sneaker store today and who also happens to be an anxious person, if that is who I have targeted, but that person happens to be someone who is a 60-year-old male, what I'm seeing as part of transparency is just that a 60-year-old male received this ad, but not really the kind of routes that I took to make this kind of advertisement. And on the right, you see the two columns are basically the kinds of feedback that an advertiser can receive about their ad campaign. So already, this is like so much more than the amount of fields of information that you have. And if you actually collect all the different suggested fields of information through which you can target, that is just that doesn't fit into the page. And also, you can not just select things that are suggested, but you could also create specific targeting on your own. But basically, that brings us to what are the frames of understanding that Facebook is willing to have a conversation about. So, because if you're talking about transparency of political ads, they're happy to talk about it. If you're speaking about accessibility of that kind of information, they're more than happy to talk about how their team can increase how accessible the API is, etc. But if you want to talk about privacy of users, they've kind of been cornered into like having to do that. But something like their business model itself or the algorithmic newsfeed, which might be kind of the central question or the elephant in the room, that then they don't want to address that kind of question.
Yeah. So maybe, I don't know, we didn't discuss it before, but maybe I'm finding now useful to use the metaphor of the onion, and that there are certain layers that we must demystify. So first of all, what is political ads labeled by Facebook? This is what Facebook considers political ads. Second, they make it so difficult to access this data, but when we access this data, it's just the column on the left. That speaks very little of what is the large range of possibilities that you have to target. So all of this, we can frame it on the question of, do we want Facebook to be more transparent in how these advertisements work? And this is the conversation that maybe we can still put some friction to work with and to have them make the platform a bit more transparent. But if we try to understand what are the economic incentives on Facebook, and we must remember that all of these questions about democracy and politics, we're speaking about a private company that moves for profit. The more hidden, the more opaque that these mechanisms work for the side of the advertiser, for the side of the user, and for the side of Facebook, the most efficient that this mechanism works. The lesser that I know why am I receiving this particular ad in this particular moment, the more effective the impact that this advertisement is to me. So they just have no incentive to make their platform as transparent as we would like it to be. And I think this is something that we should really get very firmly written in our heads, that they will do whatever comes good for their pockets. So as much as transparency they can promise us, if it reaches a point in which it goes against their business model, it's not going to transcend that border. You have something on normative standards now, right?
Yes. I mean, it's an important determination what Facebook allows as ads and what it doesn't, and I think it has larger consequences than the fact of that individual ad. So for example, recently Facebook, a couple of months back, said that it would not run ads that ask people to not vote. And that was, of course, coming from Trump's campaign that discouraged voters of a particular region, particular race to not go out and vote or give false information about the date of elections, etc. But if you think about what the function of such an ad does outside of what it is reacting to, it almost is defining the normative standards for what is acceptable as political action and what is not. And Manuel was part of a social movement called Indignados a couple of years ago that used participatory democracy as opposed to representative democracy. So where instead of me choosing or voting for someone to represent my voice, I directly represent myself. And a lot of And people that might have different political persuasions that actually might think that not voting is a political action in itself towards a larger issue. I mean, the speech of such people, or what is considered normatively acceptable, is itself, I think, shifting a bit. So it's not to say that because Facebook has banned those ads that entire possibilities for such action is gone, but really it kind of shapes what we consider acceptable, the kind of status quos that we're stuck with, etc., and really limits imaginations for what might be acceptable. And yeah.
Right. So you're still with us? Yeah, good. In this graph, you can see in gray all the countries of which we can access data, and in red, all the countries that Facebook refuses to access data. So you can see that the majority of the world actually has no access to the levels of transparency that we enjoy in the United States, in Europe, and in a few, very few other countries. And maybe it's helpful to think from the framework of digital colonialism, in how Facebook is everywhere, also in all of those countries, is extracting data, is employing extractivist methods of extraction of personal data, while not providing back levels of transparency. So what does it mean that a company comes to my country, is extracting the data of my users, but then chooses not to provide the same level of transparency? Is this a new form of digital colonialism? A lot of the discussion has been happening here in the US. It was interesting for us also when we got emails from people in countries in the African continent on why you don't have any interface for me to browse my country. Well, because Facebook has not opened the door for that data to be collected, while a lot of people is using Facebook in those countries. So this is like a larger issue beyond the 2020 elections, but it's a question of how, as Nayantara was pointing, if Facebook is defining what is political correctness, what is appropriate, not, what kind of forms of democracy are okay and which ones are not, this is being implemented worldwide, not just here in the US. And the rest, if here is very difficult to move these companies, to make changes, imagine how it feels for people in the rest of the world that have no access to that kind of conversation even. Yeah.
And maybe this also replicates itself in many policies that Facebook creates reflexively as and when things emerge. So the earlier example that I took of ProPublica pointing out that certain ads were being discriminatory, Facebook made a commitment to not have housing, healthcare, and education ads being able to exclude people of particular gender or particular race, but they limited such a policy to the US. And earlier this year, there were also reports that these policies are not really working, and you're still able to do that. But nevertheless, those are things that remain. Any kind of strong arming of Facebook remains a policy just within the US. So I think that that's also extremely problematic. And if you look at the timeline of changes to Facebook's political advertising policy, it is mostly in reaction to the US and to the European elections, to the US elections mostly, and to the Canadian elections. And that also is quite telling of the fact that the Philippines had an entire election cycle happen with no policies, not even the data that was opened up.
Yeah, or for example, we just got access to the data on Argentina a few weeks ago. So, for example, Canada is going to elections today or this week. Some of these days it's going to elections. Facebook opened the access to their tools of transparency around 2 months ago. That allowed the news cycle and journalists to pick it up, to use the tool, to explore. We ran a story in collaboration with journalists there. But in Argentina, they just opened the access 2 weeks ago, just around the corner of the elections. It's not being discussed. No one, all the journalists are already caught with reporting with what they can about the elections. So they have been releasing it very late in other countries. And this is the norm. We just read actually today that apparently Sri Lanka just got incorporated because they are facing elections in November. It's a bit like if Facebook is trying to be just behind the electoral process and releasing this transparency tool just before the election, as I'm just guessing now, but as a preemptive case, so no one can blame them after the election for the result. But this is really not enough for the populations of these countries to have time to understand what is happening in the online space. We are getting to the end, no? I'm here.
Yes.
So I think the Glassroom is also a great demonstration of how these monopolies are growing extremely powerful. And I think a lot of the discussions that we have nowadays are about monopolies of the digital space, monopolies on my email services, my cloud services, my search services, But more and more, we see how these monopolies are expanding outside of the digital, how they are going out to big tech, and I'm speaking now largely about big tech, not Facebook only, to monopolize public transportation, to monopolize education, to monopolize military infrastructure, and in the case that we are discussing today is to monopolize democratic infrastructure. Facebook has grown extremely crucial to when it comes to performing politics. Like, is the platform number one from which people receive their news? Is the platform through which people discusses with their friend about who they are going to vote? Is the platform through which we receive political messages? And no one has asked us if we want to have this one company in control of how our democracies function, in being the arbiter and the judge that defines what is political and what is not, but also defines what kind of forms of democracy are okay or not.
But it's also true that Facebook political advertising is used by people across the board. So as you might have seen that Elizabeth Warren was advocating for breaking up Facebook on Facebook. And any political candidate that you might be supporting in the US is running ads. So it has become one of the important places where people are spending their advertising budgets, for example. But what does it mean when you're using an infrastructure that basically helps you maximize your return on investment and kind of becomes a matchmaker for someone that is most likely to engage with your ad, as opposed to encouraging something more deliberative or something that might actually be of benefit for the issues that are at hand? So that is kind of the question of what beyond political ads tagged as political, what is such a news feed, what is such an ecosystem doing for politics?
Yeah. We started the presentation with this image, and this is the image of someone else that did it over. Basically, it stands for "the future is private," the famous sentence of Zuckerberg, and someone is scratching over "the future is collective," which we see as a very interesting paradox here of, and maybe it's one of the aftermaths of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, in which Facebook somehow has monopolized from the discourse of making the platform more closed. So in one hand, we want to protect the privacy of the users. In another hand, we want more openness and transparency on how their platform is functioning. Unfortunately, the aftermath of the scandal, it turned in which to Facebook closing down more and more levels of transparency. I'm supposed to finish with something on moving beyond transparency. So it's a bit not to just give us or leave us with a very pessimistic and hopeless feeling, but I mean, it's really exciting for us to be here in San Francisco, as you can tell. A lot of the discussion, or if not maybe the 99% of the discussion that we see about political ads, is within the framework of transparency. And as we started at the beginning of the talk thinking in, previously, if we will be in the public square and we see a political billboard here that says whatever, whether we agree or disagree with it, whether it's fake news or not, we are all seeing the same advertisement. So we can exercise democracy here, we can discuss this advertisement. When it comes to targeted advertisement, regardless of the level of transparency that it has, each of you are going to receive a different political message. Therefore, this completely breaks this public square in which we could before perform politics. So maybe the question that we should be critically asking ourselves is not if we want more transparency in how these political advertisements work, but whether we want or not at all to have segmented political advertisements. Is this segmented advertisement something that structurally goes against democracy? And I think we are finished with that. So thanks a lot for listening to us, and we will be super happy to take some questions. Want to move to the chat?
Sorry? Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions for Manuel, Nayantara?
Careful with this.
Sorry?
Matt?
Hi, that was a fascinating presentation. Thanks for AdWatch. I was wondering what's next for AdWatch and what's next for this continued research?
That's the 5 million question. What is next?
I think there's more countries opening up, and Facebook is slowly releasing ads of different countries. I think the most immediate thing is to incorporate that. But also, I think we're interested in understanding why are ads that Facebook is tagging as political, like what are we missing from that data set? So what is absent from what we have in front of us?
Right, so we released the project like almost 3 months ago, and we have been really struggling day and night to keep up. Like, we have been mediating the work of a lot of journalists to help them to understand the data. So I think we have been operating very much at 2 levels. One level in which we are helping journalists to understand and problematize the infrastructure of political advertisement, and on the other hand, also helping journalists in different countries to report in what political candidates in different countries are doing in the online space. We have also run a series of small investigations. So, for example, in the UK, we found a lot of advertisements that were targeted to minors, and we have a bunch more upcoming, perhaps. But as Nayantara said, we are now looking into how to collect advertisements in other countries. Perhaps we are looking into other platforms as well, that we always wanted to look into more. But I think in general, this process has beyond collecting more advertisements, I think we are now busy with the questioning whether what is the influence of targeted advertisement in whatever form you shape it into democracy?
Hi, so I'm Alex. I'm an ex-advertiser, so I worked at an ad agency for a year and worked in digital advertising, not on the social space, but worked closely with the social team. So this was really interesting to see, hear a lot of things that I've heard before, but see it in a different lens. We didn't do political advertising. So it was interesting to see all those metrics that you were showing, that slide with the 2 columns to show how little Facebook allows access to just users that want to see. Did you guys get any reasoning behind why those are the only metrics given? Because they have all of the other metrics for the people that actually bought the ads to see. So is there any, you said there was no documentation, but anything to say why they can't give you that information?
I think if you look at the metrics that are given, those are also the metrics that traditionally that you understand from advertising, right? It's not as if targeted advertising is super new, but it's more the granularity of targeted advertising. So even earlier, condom ads would only be aired late at night, or it would also, like your political messaging on vans would be targeted to neighborhoods that are going. So it's still about region, it's still about gender and age groups. That is kind of the traditional segments with which people have worked to understand advertising. So maybe that was thought of as the bare minimum that they had to do. That's just my guess. But it's also interesting, for example, that on the front end, Facebook allows you to identify in, I think, 72 different kinds of genders, a pineapple. So what is Facebook doing with people self-identifying as, or identify as different genders and possibly be part of marginalized groups of society, but it just reveals the question that what is presented either in the name of more liberatory, emancipatory kind of politics, or in the name of whatever PR happens, or in the front end, is quite different from how you get, what boxes you get slotted into at the back end at least. Do you have something to add? No? Yeah.
I have a very basic question, because I think your project is extremely outstanding in terms of the fact that you are 2 individuals living far away from each other, and within a few months you were able to access information, process that information, and present in such a way that I haven't seen any media outfit or other institution organization looking at when it comes to advertisements from Facebook. So first of all, thank you for that. But my question is more about, what is your experience with institutions, organizations, or media where you are trying to show that information to them, present it, etc.? I'm saying that because there are many other outfits out there who have much more resources and should have interest, also public interest, if you like, to present this information, access, process, and understand in the first place. What did you try? How did it work? What didn't work? I think it would be interesting to hear.
Right, we totally skipped that from the presentation. It was a new territory for us. It was something that we did not have that much experience in how to work with releases of this kind with the media. I think we have faced a lot of challenges of mediating for them to understand what is the value of this, because a lot of times they very quickly end up in the rejection of, this targeted advertisement is not that effective, therefore we are not that interested in covering it. But I think there has been a few instances in which we have found journalists that saw the value of this. The model of collaboration, it has been a bit changing. Like some outlets simply just picked the data, reported on it, didn't give us credit or anything, but they used it. In some others, we established more close forms of collaborations in which we release things together. It's a good question.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm reminded of another initiative, other initiatives that are also working on political ads transparency and that are happy to stay with this level of transparency about ads. And I think that is a bit frustrating sometimes too, because it also gets co-opted very easily by Facebook as look at all of these researchers that are doing great things with the API, whereas maybe our agenda might be to also question the fields of information that is available, the places where it might be available. So maybe a bit of frustration about that.
Yeah,
but
I think that's clear for us that we wanted to problematize the infrastructure. Most of journalists wanted to report on what was going on in their country, and we saw even instances of copycats of our work that were thanking Facebook for providing the data. And I think this was maybe one of the most frustrating situations when our work ends. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Yeah, so I'm curious, what do you guys want to do with this information? Is it just to inform, or are there clear takeaways? Do you guys want to inform journalists or other media outlets so they can report on this information, or is it directly informing consumers and then getting them to be more aware of how to best protect themselves? Do you guys have, or is it any one of those things? And ultimately, I'm curious, how do you guys will be able to keep funding your efforts, and how do you guys keep that going?
We should have a little pot for donations here, actually.
I don't want to dismiss the value of the data that is in front of us, because it does tell you a lot about many things. So for example, this image tells you not just about ads, but also the links with certain digital marketing agencies and the behaviors of different politicians. It also tells you that a lot of personal data is solicited in the form of ads, in the form of asking you to sign up. It tells you the kind of discourses that people are beginning to pick up. So if you look at the climate crisis, if you search for climate, you see that the timeline of ads about climate peaked quite recently in the aftermath of a lot of protests. So I think we are working to unpack the value of that data, but also But yeah, I think to also not play within the playground of ad transparency, because we do think at some level it is a disingenuous effort. It is an unsatisfactory effort. So to also maybe push what we can expect from companies or actually from like people in charge of making sure democracies run smoothly, but also working with journalists.
Right. If I refer to the question on whether it's for journalists, for consumers, I understood maybe with consumers, you mean the general public, citizens. I think that was the core of, we wanted to do something that was accessible for as many people as possible. And this was not easy, and actually we got some great advice from someone in tactical tech when we were just planning to release it as databases, but that would have been extremely difficult to read for any kind of regular citizen. So I think we had this very beautiful moment in the beginning of the release, in which a person in the Netherlands, just a regular person, a bit older, that was simply curious about what politicians were saying, made this thread on Twitter analyzing what one political party and the other was saying, at which time, and so on. And I think to see a regular citizen without so much technical expertise being able to understand these mechanisms through AdWatch, for me that was one of the biggest successes in terms of making it very accessible. While maybe most of the work that has been out there and most visible has been together with journalists, perhaps it's a question of what is the role of journalism. Perhaps the role of journalism is to mediate projects like this for the rest of the public. We do not have the outreach or the capacity that they have to report. But our collaborations with journalists have been, I think, more tactic from the perspective of reaching out to more people. But our end objective is to make it accessible for anyone. I mean, it's a question of if we are in a democracy, this kind of information should be available for anyone. And if we are to release it, we do not want to do the same as Facebook and just create more layers and walls of protection over it.
Any other questions? One more? Oh, two more.
Thanks. This is really interesting. So I think everybody understands that this kind of political advertising is pretty toxic. I'm not sure if you have a plan for a sort of an antidote, or if you're just putting out some sort of information stream that you hope others will grasp. I mean, where are you going with this? I mean, we all need help here. Are you going to help us? You see what I'm saying?
Do you have an antidote?
That's the 10 million question then. We are raising up the bets. Do you want to start?
Well, no, I don't think we have any clear answers. And also, I think it sometimes comes across as an unrealistic or a ridiculous thing to say that that when you're talking about political ad transparency, you necessarily have to talk about the newsfeed and the transparency of the newsfeed itself and things like that. So questioning the business model of Facebook itself. Yeah, maybe it sounds funny, but that is possibly something that such a question is what we're trying to ask. I don't know if we have a good direction from there.
I think we have to question the business model much more critically. I think all the conversations on bringing more transparency. I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves why these companies have grown so strong. Is this something that they sell advertisement space, or is rather a method of extractivism in which the thing that allows them to grow so vastly is the data that supposedly we are just giving for free? Of course, there are different political proposals of approaching the production of data as a commodity, but then we end up in situations in which your data is more valuable than mine, or you can sell your data, I don't want to, but I'm forced to, so maybe this is not the right way to go. But I think we really have to think in different frameworks of relationship between technology and users or citizens. And it's also, I think, a question, and I'm speaking now personally on my own behalf, of questioning if capitalism is the way of organizing technology that we want. Can we think, instead of using Facebook, in using alternatives that are not driven by profits? Can we think in ideas of data cooperatives? The other day we had a conversation in establishing a data cooperative for Uber-like services in the city of San Francisco that operates for the services of their citizens. I think it's as much as a technical question as much as a socio-political question. I don't think that we have like the clear antidote. I think it's a question way beyond political advertisement. I think political advertisements, it could be now one of the vectors to try to see how to change our dynamics with these companies. but it's perhaps one of the largest problems or the largest quests that we have ever faced in how to change these systems. I mean, it's in one hand a great level of opportunity, but the threats and the consequences that we are facing are huge too. But I think it's a question, as we were saying before, whether this is something for journalists, for citizens, or for everyone. I think this is something that has to operate at all layers of society. And it's not something that can be discussed just here in San Francisco, for sure. Yeah.
So we have to wrap it up, but I want to thank everyone for coming and for your amazing questions, and to Manuel and Nayantara as well for being here. And if I know them well, then I know that if you have more questions, they'll be happy to stick around and answer them for you one-on-one. So thank you very much.
Thank you.